In a world where human dignity was priced at just 10 cents, a young life hung in the balance. The cruel transaction that reduced an overweight teenager to mere pennies would soon collide with the unexpected intervention of a mountain man, whose actions defied all expectations. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The autumn air carried the sweet scent of apples and wood smoke as Grey Hollow's Harvest Festival filled the village square with life. Lanterns swung from ropes strung between oak trees, casting golden light over villagers dressed in their finest wool garments. Children darted between stalls of candied nuts and warm cider, their laughter mingling with the fiddle music that floated above the crowd. Brenna stood near the edge of the celebration, her eyes downcast as she arranged woven garlands at her uncle's stall. Though the same age as the other young women twirling in dance circles, she remained apart, accustomed to the sideways glances and whispered comments about her size. Her fingers, nimble despite their plumpness, worked steadily with the dried flowers and wheat stalks. "Come see the finest leather in the valley," Osric called out, his voice carrying the practiced charm of a traveling merchant. The tanner's face was flushed with cider and the warmth of attention as a group of men gathered around his display of belts and pouches. As the night deepened and the cider flowed more freely, Osric's boasts grew louder. He clapped a heavy hand on Brenna's shoulder, pulling her forward into the torchlight. "I've got more than leather work to offer," he announced with a wink. "My niece here a bit round but strong as an ox. Yours for just 10 cents. Who'll take her off my hands?" The crowd's laughter rolled forward, then faltered, breaking against the stunned silence that followed. Brenna's face burned hot as fire as she stared at the ground, wishing it would open and swallow her whole. "I've got a penny," someone called, triggering another wave of cruel laughter. "2 pennies," shouted another. "If she comes with a meal." Then came a movement from the edge of the crowd. Villagers parted as Calder Roan stepped forward, his tall frame and broad shoulders commanding attention without effort. The mountain man rarely attended village gatherings, preferring the solitude of his cabin in the pines. His voice, though quiet, cut through the night like a blade. "What do you value more, Osric, coin or kin?" The question hung in the air, simple yet devastating. Brenna looked up, meeting Calder's steady gaze for a heartbeat, before lowering her eyes again. But in that moment, something shifted inside her, a tiny spark of hope amid the humiliation. Osric's smile faltered. "Just a jest among friends," he muttered, suddenly interested in rearranging his leather goods. The damage was done. The festival's warm spirit curdled like milk in summer heat. Conversations resumed in uncomfortable whispers, the music somehow hollow. Brenna remained frozen beside her uncle's stall, her hands clutching her apron as the casual cruelty of the moment settled over the gathering like frost. The memory of Calder Roan's words at the Harvest Festival haunted Brenna for days. "What do you value more, coin or kin?" Those words had silenced the entire village square, but for Brenna, they had awakened something else, a curiosity that grew stronger than her fear. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and violet, she slipped away from her uncle's home. Osric had barely spoken to her since the incident, his shame manifesting as cold silence. Brenna pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she followed the narrow path that led to the edge of the forest. The mountain man's cabin appeared like a vision from an old tale, tucked beneath wind-warped pines, with smoke curling from the stone chimney. It stood apart from the village, much like its owner. Brenna hesitated at the clearing's edge, her heart hammering against her ribs. What was she doing here? What would she say? Before she could retreat, the wooden door swung open. Calder stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the warm light from within. His eyes, sharp as flint, found her immediately. "You shouldn't be wandering the forest alone at dusk," he said, his voice like gravel, not unkind, but rough from disuse. "I wanted to thank you," Brenna managed. her voice barely above a whisper. "For what you said at the festival." He studied her for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in before the night air settles in your bones." The interior of the cabin surprised her. It was orderly and clean, with a fire crackling in the hearth. But what caught her eye were the dozens of small wooden figurines arranged carefully on the mantel. Animals, people, mythical creatures, all carved with remarkable detail. "Did you make these?" she asked, approaching them with wonder. Calder nodded, setting a kettle over the fire. "Some are from past fairs. Others were left by children who found their way here over the years." "Lost children?" "Forgotten ones, mostly," he replied, the hardness in his face softening slightly. "Like you." The bluntness of his words should have stung, but they didn't. There was no mockery in them, no pity, only recognition. He handed her a cup of herbal tea, the steam carrying the scent of mountain herbs that Era, the village midwife, often sought for her remedies. "Why did you come here truly?" he asked, settling into a hand-carved chair. Brenna cradled the warm cup between her palms. "In the village, I'm nothing but Osric's burden, a joke." She looked up at him. "But when you spoke, it was the first time anyone treated me like I had value." The mountain man's eyes held hers, and Brenna felt something unfamiliar in his gaze. Respect, perhaps. It was a stark contrast to the taunts and whispers she'd grown accustomed to in Grey Hollow. "Value isn't measured in coins," Calder said simply. "Remember that." As darkness fell completely outside, Brenna felt strangely at peace in this solitary man's presence, sensing that in this cabin of quiet dignity, she might find something she'd never known in the village, a place where she belonged. Winter descended upon Grey Hollow with merciless intent. The first snowfall had been gentle, dusting the thatched roofs like sugar on pastries. But as days shortened, the storms grew violent. Villagers huddled around hearths, sharing worried glances as wind howled through cracks in wooden walls. No one expected the mountain to break. It happened just before dawn. The sound began as a distant rumble that many mistook for thunder, until it swelled into a roar that shook the very foundations of homes. Calder Roan woke instantly, recognizing the deadly signature of sliding snow. From his cabin window, he watched in grim silence as a wall of white cascaded down the northern slope, swallowing trees and boulders in its path. By first light, the devastation was clear. 3 homes on the village outskirts lay crushed beneath tons of snow and debris. The main path to the neighboring settlement was completely blocked, cutting off Grey Hollow from outside help. Panic spread faster than the bitter cold as villagers realized they were trapped. "We need to organize search parties," Osric shouted in the square, his voice betraying more fear than authority. "There could be survivors under there." But no one moved. The villagers, paralyzed by shock and the biting cold, stood frozen in place. It was Brenna who acted first. Without a word to her uncle, she wrapped herself in the thickest cloak she could find and trudged through knee-deep snow toward the forest edge. The journey to Calder's cabin, normally 30 minutes, took her nearly 2 hours as she fought against the drifts. When she finally reached his door, she found him already dressed in layers of fur, packing supplies into a worn leather satchel. "I knew someone would come," he said simply, handing her a steaming cup of herbal tea. "Drink this, then we work." Together they returned to the village, where Calder immediately took charge. The mountain man divided the able-bodied into teams, assigning each a section of the buried homes to excavate. He demonstrated how to probe the snow with long sticks, listening for responses beneath. "Dig in triangles," he instructed, his breath visible in the frigid air. "And listen between strikes. A trapped person may only have strength for one call." By midday, they had rescued 4 villagers, including an elderly couple who would have surely perished without intervention. Even Halden, normally quick to challenge Calder's authority, worked silently alongside him, grudging respect evident in his nod when they pulled a child from the wreckage. As darkness fell again, exhausted rescuers gathered in the meeting hall. Era moved among them, treating frostbite and distributing broth. Across the room, Brenna watched as villagers approached Calder one by one, offering quiet thanks or simply a hand on his shoulder. For the first time since she'd known him, the solitary man seemed truly part of Grey Hollow. Calder Roan's cabin, once a sanctuary of solitude, now buzzed with the murmurs of 24 villagers, bodies pressed together on rough-hewn benches and floor spaces, sharing warmth as the avalanche's aftermath settled into their bones. Pinewood smoke curled from the hearth, carrying the scent of resin and safety through the cramped quarters. "Your mother always said juniper was best for difficult births," Era said, her weathered hands sorting through Calder's herb collection. The midwife's fingers moved with practiced precision, separating dried leaves and berries. "I never thought I'd be asking for her remedies again after all these years." Calder paused in the midst of distributing blankets. "You knew my mother well?" "She trained me," Era replied, her voice softening with memory. "Before you were born, I spent 3 summers learning her ways. The mountain speaks to your bloodline differently than to the rest of us." The revelation hung in the air between them. Villagers who had always viewed the mountain man as an outsider now exchanged glances, connecting him to their shared history for the first time. Across the room, Brenna tended to an elderly man with a sprained wrist, wrapping it carefully, as Calder had shown her. She caught fragments of conversation, piecing together the unexpected connection between the midwife and her reluctant host. "Hold this steady," she instructed the old man, mimicking the firm but gentle tone Calder used when teaching her knots by the stream. The elder complied without complaint, a stark contrast to the dismissive sneers she usually received. When Halden entered with the last of the rescued supplies, his eyes narrowed at the scene. The smith's gaze lingered on Brenna, then shifted to Calder with poorly disguised contempt. "The south path should be clear by morning," he announced, dropping his load by the door. "Those who can walk should return to their homes then." Calder merely nodded, continuing to distribute hot tea brewed from pine needles and honey. His calloused hands, capable of breaking branches for firewood, now carefully passed steaming cups to trembling fingers. Brenna observed the quiet tenderness beneath his gruff exterior. When a young child cried from cold, he wordlessly removed his own woolen scarf and wrapped it around the small shoulders. When old Rune began coughing, Calder produced a tincture from a hidden shelf without being asked. As night deepened, stories flowed like the tea, tales of past winters, lost travelers, and mountain legends. For once, Brenna found herself listening rather than being the subject of cruel jokes. Her hands, busy with meaningful work, no longer felt like burdens to hide. "You have steady hands," Era whispered, watching her dress a wound. "A healer's touch." The simple praise warmed Brenna more than the fire. For the first time in Grey Hollow, her presence was valued beyond mockery, her worth measured by skill rather than appearance. The winter refused to loosen its grip on Grey Hollow, burying the village beneath layers of pristine snow. Calder Roan spent his days chopping wood and tending to his cabin, but the isolation amplified the ghosts that haunted him. In the quiet evenings, when the wind howled through the pines, memories of his younger brother surfaced with painful clarity. Brenna noticed the change during her visits. The mountain man's eyes would sometimes drift to the window, his weathered face a mask of sorrow. One afternoon, as they sat by the fire drinking herbal tea from chipped mugs, she gathered her courage. "You seem troubled," she said softly. "More than usual." Calder's hands tightened around his mug. "Winter brings memories." "Of what?" Brenna pressed gently, her own experiences with ridicule giving her unexpected strength. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of burning logs. Finally, Calder set down his drink and reached for a small carved figurine on the mantel. a boy with arms outstretched. "My brother Finn," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "He was 12 when it happened. I was 17. Brenna waited patiently as he traced the wooden figure's features with his thumb. "We were exploring the eastern ridge. I knew better. Spring thaws make the slopes unstable. But he begged, and I—" Calder's voice faltered. The landslide came without warning. One moment he was laughing, the next— But the midwife had mentioned once that Calder's family had suffered tragedy, but hearing it from him made the pain immediate and raw. "I dug for hours," he continued. "By the time I found him, it was too late." "It wasn't your fault," Brenna whispered. "Wasn't it?" His eyes met hers. "Everyone I've ever cared for suffers. My mother died of grief within the year. The village whispered that I was cursed." Understanding dawned on Brenna. His isolation wasn't just preference, it was penance. His intervention at the harvest festival suddenly made sense. He couldn't stand by watching someone else be devalued, not when he carried such weight himself. "Is that why you live apart? Why you rarely come to the village?" Calder nodded slowly. "Better to keep my distance. Safer for everyone." Brenna reached across the table and placed her hand on his, a gesture that would have been unthinkable months ago. "Yet you taught me to find herbs, to tie knots that could save lives. You helped during the avalanche. That's different." "Is it?" she challenged. "You've convinced yourself that closeness brings hardship, but your distance hasn't healed anything." The mountain man stared at her hand on his, then at the figurine of his brother. For the first time in years, he wondered if his self-imposed exile was protection or punishment. Outside, snow continued to fall, but within the cabin, something frozen began to thaw. The first warm breeze of spring swept through Gray Hollow, melting the last patches of snow that had clung stubbornly to the shadows. After months of isolation following the avalanche, the villagers emerged from their homes like bears from hibernation, eager for connection and celebration. The Spring River Rite, a tradition as old as the village itself, would mark their survival and hope for prosperity in the coming seasons. Women wove garlands of early wildflowers, while men carved small wooden boats to carry offerings downstream. Children ran through the village square with faces painted in blue swirls, representing the river's life-giving flow. Yet beneath the festive preparations, tension simmered. Brenna noticed it while helping Era prepare herbal bundles for the ceremony. "Some think we should modernize the rite," the midwife explained, her fingers nimbly tying stems together. "Others believe changing even one word might anger the waters." This division became clear as villagers gathered at the riverbank. Halden stood with the younger craftsmen, their faces showing barely concealed impatience with the elaborate rituals. Meanwhile, Old Rune led the traditionalists in solemn chants, their voices rising and falling like the current itself. Calder Roan arrived late, standing apart as was his custom. The mountain man's presence still commanded attention, though the winter's shared hardships had softened some of the village's wariness toward him. Brenna caught his eye and offered a small smile, remembering how his cabin had become a sanctuary during the avalanche's aftermath. As offerings were placed in the water, something extraordinary happened. A large trout, silver scales flashing in the sunlight, leaped from the river and landed directly at Calder's feet, flapping wildly before he gently returned it to the water. A hush fell over the gathering. Old Rune pushed through the crowd, his weathered face alight with wonder. "The river has chosen," the elder proclaimed, pointing a trembling finger at Calder. "The prophecy speaks of one who bridges mountain and valley, who receives the river's blessing in the time of great change." Whispers erupted among the villagers. Some crossed themselves, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Halden's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Calder stood frozen, discomfort evident in his rigid posture. He had come to tolerate the village's attention after the winter rescue, But this felt different, heavier, laden with expectations he never sought. Yet as the crowd parted before him, a strange authority settled on his shoulders. Osric, who had avoided Calder since the Harvest Festival incident, now bowed his head respectfully. Even those who had questioned the old ways looked to the mountain man with newfound curiosity. Brenna watched it all, understanding better than most how unwelcome this spotlight must be for her mentor. Still, she couldn't help wondering if perhaps the river had indeed recognized something in Calder that the village had been too blind to see. The early spring air carried a crisp bite as Calder Roan led Brenna through the awakening forest. His weathered hands occasionally pointed to subtle signs most villagers would miss: a bent twig, disturbed soil, or the faint impression of a deer's hoof. "Look there," he said, crouching beside a patch of green shoots. "Wild onions. Good for flavor, better for medicine." His calloused fingers demonstrated the proper way to harvest without destroying the bulb. Brenna watched intently, her eyes bright with curiosity as she mimicked his movements. These lessons began innocently enough. After the avalanche, the young woman had shown genuine interest in Calder's knowledge of survival. What started as casual instruction evolved into regular excursions, dawn meetings at the forest edge where the mountain man shared skills passed down through generations of his family. "Your hands need to feel the rope," Calder instructed one afternoon beside a gurgling stream. "Not just hold it." He guided her fingers through a complex knot, one that could secure a shelter or haul water from a deep ravine. The girl's determination showed in her furrowed brow as she practiced until her fingertips grew raw. Word of these meetings spread through Grey Hollow like wildfire. At Halden's forge, men exchanged dark whispers about impropriety. "What business does that hermit have with Osric's niece?" they muttered between hammer strikes. The smith himself stoked these concerns, his eyes narrowing whenever Brenna passed by with a basket of freshly gathered herbs. In Ira's home, however, the midwife defended the arrangement. "The girl is learning what we all should know," she told the women who gathered for evening tea. "Our dependence on men's protection has cost us our own wisdom." Several nodded in agreement. Having witnessed Brenna's growing confidence, Osric remained conspicuously silent on the matter. The tanner avoided his niece's gaze when she returned with dirt under her nails and knowledge in her eyes. His shame lingered, festering beneath his practiced indifference. For Brenna, these lessons represented more than survival skills. Each plant identified, each track followed, each knot mastered built something she'd never possessed: self-reliance. The young woman who once shrank from mockery now stood taller, her voice steadier when she spoke. "You're a quick study," Calder remarked one evening as they returned to the village edge. He rarely offered praise, making his words all the more valuable. "I have a good teacher," she replied simply. Between them grew something neither had anticipated: a bond forged not through obligation or pity, but mutual respect. The mountain man found unexpected satisfaction in sharing his knowledge, while his student discovered strengths long buried beneath others' expectations. As spring deepened, so did their connection, built on the honest foundation of shared work rather than the hollow currency of barter and obligation that had first brought them together. The forge glowed red-hot as Halden brought his hammer down on the anvil, each thunderous strike punctuating his words. "The mountain man has no business teaching our young ones," he declared to the circle of men gathered around the heat. "Especially not a girl like Brenna." The smith's massive shoulders tensed as he plunged the horseshoe into water, steam hissing like his whispered accusations. For weeks, Halden had been stoking resentment among the villagers, his workshop becoming a gathering place for those uncomfortable with change. The smith's ambitions had always been transparent to some. He'd long positioned himself as Grey Hollow's voice of tradition, a counterweight to outsiders like Calder Roan. "He's filling her head with dangerous ideas," Halden continued, wiping sweat from his brow. teaching her to wander the wild places alone. What kind of future is that for a proper village girl? The market day brought everyone to the village square, stalls laden with early summer goods. Brenna stood near Ira's herb table, helping the midwife arrange bundles of dried plants. Her newfound confidence was evident in her straight posture and clear eyes, no longer downcast as they once had been. Calder entered the square carrying freshly caught trout. He nodded briefly to Brenna, their silent acknowledgments speaking volumes to watchful eyes. This subtle exchange was all Halden needed. "Roan!" The smith's voice boomed across the square, silencing the market chatter. He strode forward, still wearing his leather apron. "I've something to say to you." The mountain man turned slowly, his weathered face impassive. "Speak then," he replied, his voice low but carrying. "You've taken it upon yourself to guide Osric's niece," Halden announced, loud enough for all to hear. "By what right do you lead her away from our ways? What do you teach her in those woods that we can't see?" The accusation hung in the air, its implications clear. Villagers began to gather, forming a circle around the two men. "I teach her to survive," Calder answered simply. "To know the mountains that feed this valley. We've survived for generations without your interference," Halden countered. "You corrupt our traditions with every lesson." The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others frowning in disagreement. Old Rune watched from the edge, his eyes narrowed in assessment. Era stepped closer to Brenna, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "Speak plainly," Calder challenged. "Is your concern for tradition or for your own standing?" Halden's face darkened. "My concern is for the girl who was nearly bartered away once. Are you any better, taking her under your wing? What price do you extract for your teachings?" The accusation struck like a physical blow. Villagers shifted uncomfortably, forced to examine their own complicity in what had nearly happened to Brenna at the Harvest Festival. The confrontation had exposed not just the division between two men, but the fracture running through Grey Hollow itself, between those clinging to the past and those glimpsing a different future. Osric hunched over his tankard at the village tavern, his weathered fingers tracing the rim as he muttered the same defense for the 5th time that evening. "It was just a jest, nothing more," he insisted to the few patrons still willing to listen. "Anyone with sense would know that." But the tanner's words rang hollow, even to his own ears. Each night since the Harvest Festival, sleep came harder, haunted by the memory of Brenna's face when he'd offered her for 10 cents. His niece now avoided their shared home, spending days in the forest with Calderon and evenings at Era's cottage. The distance between them stretched wider than the mountain pass in winter. "A man can't even make a simple joke anymore," Osric complained, louder now as the tavern emptied. Only the barkeep remained, wiping down tables with practiced indifference. The tanner's shame had curdled into resentment, a bitter brew he drank deeply each night. It was during one such evening that Halden approached, settling his broad frame onto the bench across from Osric. The smith's presence commanded attention, his muscled arms bearing the marks of his trade. "Your niece grows closer to the mountain man each day," Halden observed, his voice low enough that only Osric could hear. "People talk. They wonder if she'll return to your home at all." Osric's face flushed. "She's just being stubborn. She'll come around." Halden leaned forward, the scent of smoke and metal clinging to him. "What if I told you I could make your jest real, but better?" From his pocket, he produced 3 silver coins that caught the dim tavern light. Not 10 cents, real silver for her hand. The tanner's eyes widened. Silver could buy new tools, better leather, perhaps even a proper workshop instead of the lean-to where he currently worked. "You take her as wife?" Osric asked, voice barely above a whisper. "I'd give her purpose," Halden replied, sliding the coins across the rough-hewn table. "And you'd have your dignity restored. The village would see it wasn't a thoughtless joke, but a negotiation between men of standing." Osric's fingers hovered over the silver, torn between temptation and the last threads of familial duty. Brenna might not agree. Women rarely know what's best for them at first, the smith countered. Once she's settled, she'll thank you. Better me than that hermit who fills her head with wilderness nonsense. The bargain hung between them, transforming what had been a cruel jest into something far more binding. Osric closed his hand around the coins, feeling their weight and the burden they carried. Neither man noticed Era's apprentice slipping out the tavern door, rushing to carry word of this new betrayal to the midwife, and through her to Brenna and Calder. Era clutched her herb pouch tightly as she marched across the village square. The midwife had spent decades bringing new life into Grey Hollow, but never before had she felt such urgency to protect one already living. The morning light caught in her silver-streaked hair as she spotted Osric haggling with a customer over tanned hides. "A word, Tanner," she called, her voice carrying the authority earned through countless births and deaths witnessed. When Osric turned, his face fell at the sight of her determined approach. "I've business to attend," he muttered. But Era stood firm. "Your business with your niece concerns us all," she said. "Have you truly considered what you started with your thoughtless jest? Now Halden speaks of silver as if Brenna were a mare at auction." Several villagers slowed their pace, ears tuned to the confrontation. Osric's shoulders hunched defensively. "It was harmless talk that others have twisted," he insisted, though his eyes wouldn't meet hers. "The girl lacks direction. Halden offers stability." Era scoffed. "Stability or ownership? I've delivered every babe in this valley for 30 years, watched girls grow under the weight of arrangements made without their consent." She lowered her voice. "Your sister would weep to see what you've done." The mention of his sister struck home. Osric flinched visibly. Later that afternoon, Era knocked at Calder Roan's cabin door, determination outweighing her usual reluctance to venture so far from the village center. When the mountain man appeared, she wasted no time. "Halden grows bolder," she explained, accepting the wooden cup of tea he offered. "He's convinced half the elders that tradition demands Brenna's compliance. The other half fear speaking against him." Calder's weathered face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened around his own cup. "And what do you seek from me?" "Alliance," the midwife replied simply. "Your mother taught me healing before you were born. She believed in a woman's right to choose her path. I believe you do too." A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks dancing upward. Outside, the wind whispered through pine needles. "The village respects you," she continued. "Not just for the avalanche rescue, but for what they sense in you. Stand with me against this bargain, and others will find courage to do the same." Calder studied the herbs hanging from his rafters, many gathered with Brenna's help these past months. "This goes beyond one girl," he said finally. Era nodded. "It always has. Every generation we fight the same battle in different forms, but perhaps this time we might truly change things." As she departed, Era noticed Brenna approaching from the forest path, arms full of freshly gathered plants. The midwife smiled grimly. Their fates were now intertwined, the aging healer, the mountain recluse, and the girl valued at 10 cents, against centuries of unyielding tradition. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on Grey Hollow, turning the once verdant fields into a patchwork of yellowed stalks and cracked earth. For 3 weeks, not a single cloud had darkened the relentless blue sky. Villagers watched helplessly as their crops withered and wells began to run dry, the drought tightening its grip with each passing day. Desperation grew like the cracks in the parched soil. Children carried smaller and smaller buckets from the village well, which was now little more than a muddy puddle. Livestock grew thin, their rids visible beneath dusty hides. The council, led by Old Rune, gathered in the square to discuss their dwindling options. "We need Calder Roan," Era finally said, her voice cutting through the circular arguments. "He knows the hidden springs in the mountains." Pride was a luxury they could no longer afford, A delegation trudged up the winding path to Calder's cabin, swallowing their earlier criticisms along with the dust that coated their throats. The mountain man listened silently as they explained their plight, his weathered face revealing nothing. "I'll show you the water paths," he finally agreed, "but I won't go alone." To everyone's surprise, he requested Brenna's assistance. The young woman, once mocked and nearly bartered away for 10 cents, had transformed under his tutelage. Her knowledge of the mountain's secrets had grown steadily through their lessons, and the villagers now looked to her with newfound respect. The next morning, Brenna led the first group along deer trails that wound through parched underbrush. Her confidence was evident in every step as she pointed out landmarks Calder had taught her to recognize. When they reached a narrow ravine hidden between two granite outcroppings, she brushed aside dried leaves to reveal a thin trickle of water seeping from the rock face. "It's not much," she explained, "but it's clean and constant. The mountain never truly dries." Over the following days, Calder and his student guided several expeditions to hidden springs and sheltered pools. Halden initially refused to join, his pride still smarting from their ongoing conflict, but thirst eventually drove even the stubborn Smith to follow their lead. The midwife watched with quiet satisfaction as Brenna organized water collection rotations, ensuring fair distribution among all households. The girl who had once shrunk from attention now commanded respect with her calm competence. "You've taught her well," Era remarked to Calder as they filled their vessels at a secluded pool. He shook his head. "She always had this strength. She just needed someone to see it." As villagers worked together to conserve their precious water supply, old grievances temporarily faded. The drought had scorched their fields, but watered something else entirely, a reluctant cooperation that bridged long-standing divides, proving that necessity could indeed bend even the most stubborn spirits. The crackle came first, a sound like kindling catching in a hearth, but magnified 100-fold. Then the sky darkened with smoke that rolled across the parched valley. Lightning had struck the eastern ridge, igniting the drought-stricken forest where Grey Hollow's children had gone berry-picking that morning. "Fire in the high woods!" The cry echoed through the village square as mothers clutched their hearts and fathers grabbed water buckets, though all knew such measures would be futile against a mountain ablaze. Brenna stood frozen for only a moment before clarity washed over her. "Calder showed me the hidden paths," she said, her voice steady despite the panic surrounding her. "I know where they'll be." Without waiting for approval, she grabbed a damp cloth and a water skin, tying both to her belt as Calderon had taught her. The mountain man was 3 valleys away trading for supplies, too far to help now. This would be her trial alone. "You'll die up there, girl," Halden warned, his massive blacksmith's arms folded across his chest. "Wait for the men to organize." But Brenna was already moving, her sturdy legs carrying her up the slope while others still debated. Era, the midwife, silenced Halden with a glare. "Let her go. She knows Calder's ways better than any of us." The heat intensified as Brenna climbed, smoke stinging her eyes and throat. She recalled Calder's lessons: stay low, follow game trails, look for the green patches where moisture lingers. Most importantly, panic kills faster than flame. She found the children huddled in a rocky hollow, 7 frightened faces streaked with tears and soot. "Follow me," she commanded, her voice channeling Calder's calm authority. "Single file, hand to shoulder, eyes on my back." The descent became a nightmare of crackling branches and falling embers. Twice they had to backtrack when flames leapt across their path. When little Thomas began coughing uncontrollably, Brenna hoisted him onto her back without breaking stride. They emerged from the smoke-choked forest as the sun was setting, 8 figures silhouetted against the burning mountainside. The waiting villagers rushed forward, snatching children into desperate embraces. Osric watched from a distance, his niece transformed before his eyes, not the girl he'd carelessly offered for 10 cents. but a woman who commanded respect through action rather than words. "You saved them all," Era said later, applying salve to Brenna's smoke-reddened hands. "I remembered what Calder taught me," she replied simply. That night, as Grey Hollow counted its blessings beneath a sky glowing orange with distant flames, whispers spread from home to home. The girl, once mocked for her size and silence, had proven her worth beyond any man's reckoning. No coin could measure such courage. No bargain could contain such spirit. Exhaustion weighed on Brenna's shoulders as she and Calderon made their way back from the wildfire. Soot blackened their faces, and the smell of smoke clung to their clothes. The mountain man walked slightly ahead, his steps sure despite the fatigue evident in his posture. "There's a shortcut through here," he said, gesturing toward a dense thicket of pines she'd never noticed before. "It'll get us back to my cabin faster." Brenna followed him through the narrow path, pushing aside branches until suddenly the forest opened into a small clearing. She gasped at what stood before them. 7 ancient stones, each taller than a man, formed a perfect circle in the hidden glade. Moss clung to their weathered surfaces, but the markings carved into them remained clear, intricate spirals and angular symbols that seemed to pulse with meaning. "I've never seen this place before," she whispered, approaching the nearest stone. Calder's expression shifted from surprise to recognition. "I found it years ago, but I've never shown anyone." He pulled out his family knife, the blade worn thin from generations of use. "Look." The young woman leaned closer, her eyes widening. The same symbols that adorned the stones were etched into the handle of his knife, concentric circles intersected by 3 diagonal lines. "Your family's mark," she said, understanding dawning on her face. The mountain man nodded, his calloused fingers tracing the carvings. "My mother said it was passed down for generations. I never knew what it meant." They returned to Grey Hollow the next morning with Old Rune in tow. The elder moved slowly through the forest, leaning heavily on his walking stick, but his eyes brightened when they reached the stone circle. "By the old gods," he whispered, running his wrinkled hands over the markings. "The Guardian's circle. We thought it lost to time." Old Rune turned to Calder, his gaze intense. "These are the signs of the Protector bloodline. The ancient stories speak of a family bound to shield Grey Hollow from calamity." He pointed to the knife. "Your ancestors were chosen guardians, Calder. The prophecy says when disasters threaten in succession, avalanche, fire, drought, the true guardian will emerge." Brenna watched as Calder's face darkened with the weight of these words. The midwife's apprentice had seen him rescue villagers from snow, guide them to water during drought, and teach her to survive. But she also recognized the doubt in his eyes. Later, as they walked back alone, she noticed his silence. "You don't believe it," she said simply. Calder sighed, the burden of expectation visible in his hunched shoulders. "I couldn't even protect my own brother. How am I supposed to be anyone's guardian?" "You've already been mine," Brenna replied softly, her words hanging in the air between them as they continued toward his cabin, the prophecy's shadow following close behind. The summer weaving market transformed Grey Hollow's village square into a tapestry of colors and tensions. Brenna walked among the stalls, acutely aware of the whispers that followed her. No longer was she simply Osric's niece. She had become the living embodiment of the village's internal struggle. Era had organized a quiet rebellion among the women weavers. Their tapestries told stories without words. One depicted a bird breaking free from a cage. Another showed a woman standing tall before mountains. The midwife herself had crafted a bold piece showing hands releasing a dove, the symbolism unmistakable to anyone with eyes to see. "Your presence gives them courage," Era whispered to Brenna, as they passed a group of young women who nodded respectfully. "They've always feared speaking against tradition." Across the market, Halden Smith hammered at his portable forge with unnecessary force, each strike seeming to punctuate his growing frustration. The blacksmith had lost standing in recent weeks as villagers increasingly sought Calder's counsel on matters beyond metalwork. "The mountain hermit thinks himself above our ways," Halden growled to a circle of older men. "And that girl follows him like a shadow, forgetting her place." His words carried just far enough to reach Brenna's ears, intended to wound. Calder arrived midday, his tall figure causing a ripple of attention. He moved through the crowd with deliberate calm, stopping to examine a tapestry woven by Marta, one of Ira's apprentices. The piece depicted the stone circle near his cabin, rendered in threads of gray and green. "Your skill honors the stones," he said simply, placing 2 silver coins in her palm, twice the asking price. The gesture wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Halden, whose face darkened as he watched. When Brenna approached Calder, the smith abandoned his forge and intercepted them, his broad shoulders blocking their path. "Quite the champion of our women you've become," he said, voice dripping with contempt. "Perhaps you've forgotten that some things aren't yours to change, mountain man." The market fell silent, commerce pausing as the confrontation unfolded. Brenna felt her heart hammering, but stood her ground beside Calder. "I've changed nothing," Calder replied evenly. "I've merely shown respect where it was already due." Several women moved closer, their presence a silent statement. Ira stepped forward, her weathered hands steady as she placed herself between the men. "The market welcomes all who come in peace, Halden," she said firmly. "Your quarrel has no place among our craft." The smith retreated, but his eyes promised this wasn't finished. As he stalked away, the market slowly resumed its rhythm, though the undercurrent of tension remained. "This isn't just about me anymore, is it?" Brenna asked quietly. Calder shook his head. It never was. The ancient stones loomed like silent sentinels as twilight descended over Grey Hollow. Calder led Brenna through the forest path, his steps deliberate yet hesitant. The stone circle had stood for generations, weathered by time yet unyielding, much like the mountain man himself. "My mother used to bring me here," Calder said, his voice barely audible above the evening breeze. His calloused fingers traced the markings on the nearest stone, identical to those on his family knife. Before the accident, Brenna watched him carefully, noting how his broad shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. The circle felt sacred somehow, a place where truths could no longer hide behind silence. "I was 16 when it happened," he continued, settling onto a fallen log. "My brother was only 11. I was supposed to watch him that day." His eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. "The landslide came without warning. I reached for him, but..." His voice broke, the unfinished sentence hanging between them. The young woman moved closer, her presence steady. The man who had defended her dignity at the harvest festival now revealed his own broken pieces. "All these years I've lived apart because I believed I deserved nothing else," Calder confessed. "My solitude wasn't strength. It was punishment. Every day alone was penance for the one I couldn't save." Brenna's hand found his, her touch gentle yet firm. "Is that why you stepped forward that night, when my uncle offered me for 10 cents? The mountain man nodded slowly. "I couldn't bear to watch another person valued so carelessly. Not when I..." He paused, gathering courage. "Not when I know the worth of a life that's lost." "You gave me dignity when others only saw someone to mock," Brenna said. Her voice had grown stronger over the months of his teaching. "You showed me how to find strength in myself." The midwife had told her once that healing sometimes required reopening wounds. As darkness settled around them, Brenna recognized the truth of Era's wisdom. "Perhaps you've punished yourself long enough," she suggested. "Your brother wouldn't want this life for you." Calder looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing clearly for the first time. "When did you become so wise?" A hint of a smile softened his weathered face. "I had a good teacher," she replied. As they sat surrounded by ancient stones, their conversation continued long into the night. Two souls finding connection through shared pain. Their partnership, forged through seasons of avalanche and drought, deepened not through pity but through mutual understanding. When they finally walked back toward the village, something had shifted between them. The mountain man's step seemed lighter, as if part of his burden had been left behind among the stones that had witnessed so many of Grey Hollow's secrets. Halden paced the length of his forge, the glow of embers casting his shadow long against the wall. His patience had worn thin. For months, he'd watched as Calder Roan's influence spread through Grey Hollow like wildfire, undermining everything the smith had built. "You gave your word," Halden growled, tossing 3 silver coins onto the workbench before Osric. The metal clinked against wood, the sound cutting through the smoky air. "The girl was offered in jest, but I mean to make it real. Take the silver. End this nonsense." The tanner stared at the coins, his weathered face a battlefield of emotions. Since that fateful harvest festival, Osric had watched his niece slip further from his grasp, growing stronger under Calder's tutelage. His careless words had sparked a transformation he never intended. "The village talks," Osric muttered, fingers hovering over the silver without touching it. "They say I've lost my honor." "They'll forget once it's settled," the smith countered, his massive arms folded across his chest. "Traditions exist for a reason. The mountain man has no right to interfere." Outside, rain began to fall, drumming against the forge's roof. Osric finally pocketed the coins with trembling hands. "I'll speak to her tomorrow. Make the arrangements." Neither man noticed young Tam, the cooper's son, crouched beneath the window, eyes wide with shock. The boy slipped away into the rain, racing toward the village square. By nightfall, the news had spread like poison. Women gathered in Ira's home, their voices rising in anger. The midwife moved between them, her calm presence a counterpoint to their fury. "This cannot stand," she declared, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "I must warn Calder." The path to the mountain man's cabin was treacherous in the dark, but Ira knew it well. She found him whittling by firelight, his knife moving steadily across a piece of pine. "Halden has sealed the bargain," she announced without preamble. 3 pieces of silver for Brenna's future. Calder's hand stilled. "And Osric agreed?" "He did," the midwife confirmed. "They plan to announce it tomorrow." The mountain man set aside his carving and stood, his shadow stretching across the cabin floor. "Then tomorrow I'll meet them in the square." "This isn't just about Brenna anymore," Ira cautioned. "The village is divided. Whatever you do will echo for generations." Calder nodded, his expression resolute. "Some echoes need to be heard." He reached for his family knife, the one bearing the same markings as the ancient stone circle. "Tell Brenna to be ready. The time for silence is over." As Ira departed, Calder stared into the flames, preparing for the confrontation that would test not just his courage, but the very soul of Grey Hollow. The harvest festival arrived with a riot of colors, the village square transformed by garlands and flickering lanterns. As twilight settled over Grey Hollow, Old Rune took his place at the center of the gathering. The elder's weathered hands gestured dramatically as he commanded everyone's attention, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "The signs have spoken," Old Rune proclaimed, his eyes bright with fervor. "The avalanche, the drought, the fire, all tests sent to reveal our true guardian." He pointed a gnarled finger directly at Calder Roan. "This man, born of the ancient bloodline, carries the markings on his family blade that match the sacred stones. He is the one foretold to shield our valley from ruin." Murmurs rippled through the villagers. Calder stood uncomfortably as all eyes turned to him, his jaw tightening beneath his beard. Brenna watched from nearby, concern etched across her features. "I am no chosen one," Calder finally spoke. his deep voice cutting through the whispers. "The knife was my father's, nothing more." He stepped forward, addressing not just the elder, but everyone gathered. "If this past year has taught me anything, it's that protection comes not from prophecy, but from how we treat one another." The mountain man moved toward Brenna, gesturing toward her, but careful not to claim her. This young woman faced mockery and was nearly bartered away like cattle. Yet when flames threatened your children, she led them to safety. When thirst parched your fields, she helped find water. Era nodded vigorously from among the women, her presence lending weight to his words. Several mothers clutched their children closer, remembering the wildfire and Brenna's courage. "If I am to be your guardian," Calder continued, "then let it be by choice, not blood, and let my first act be to declare that no person in this valley shall ever again be valued in coins or traded like goods." Halden pushed forward from the crowd, his face flushed with anger. "You would overturn centuries of tradition? Who are you to—" "He speaks truth," interrupted Osric unexpectedly, shame visible in his downcast eyes. "My niece deserved better than my thoughtless jest." The villagers fell silent, the weight of change hanging heavy in the autumn air. Old Rune studied Calder thoughtfully, then slowly nodded. "Perhaps," the elder said, "this is the true fulfillment. Not that you would save us from natural disaster, but from ourselves." As darkness deepened, the festival lanterns cast long shadows across faces both troubled and hopeful. The prophecy had indeed come to pass, though not as anyone had imagined. And in that moment, Grey Hollow stood at the threshold of transformation, with Calder and Brenna as its unlikely catalysts. The autumn air hung thick with tension as the villagers of Grey Hollow pressed together in the square. Calder Roan stood tall, his weathered face set with determination as he faced Osric and Halden. The smith's silver coins gleamed mockingly in the afternoon light, a stark symbol of what had begun as a careless jest at last year's festival. "I reject this bargain," Calder announced, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "And I reject the very idea that any person can be bartered away like cattle." His eyes found Brenna in the crowd, standing near Era. "This young woman deserves to choose her own path, as do all the daughters of Grey Hollow." Halden stepped forward, hammer-calloused hands clenched at his sides. "You have no right to interfere in our traditions," he growled. "The agreement was made." "An agreement made in mockery," Calder interrupted, "and pursued in greed. Look around you." He gestured to the gathered villagers. "For generations, we've allowed words spoken in jest to become binding chains. We've valued coin over kin. Is this truly the legacy we wish to preserve?" Osric shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet his niece's gaze. The tanner's earlier bravado had crumbled under the weight of the mountain man's words. A murmur rippled through the crowd as neighbors exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others frowning in confusion. Old Rune watched from the edge, his ancient eyes gleaming with something like satisfaction. Then Brenna stepped forward. No longer the shy, mocked girl of last autumn, she stood straight-backed and clear-eyed. The months of learning from Calder, of finding her strength in the wilderness and during the wildfire, had transformed her. "I am not for sale," she declared, her voice steady despite its softness. "Not for 10 cents, not for silver, not for any price." She looked directly at her uncle. "My worth isn't measured by your words or Halden's coins." Era moved to stand beside her, the midwife's presence lending silent support. Several other women followed, forming a protective semicircle. "I choose my own path," Brenna continued. "I choose to learn the mountains. I choose to help those who need it. I choose dignity over tradition when tradition has lost its heart." The silence that followed wasn't born of shock or outrage, but something deeper, a collective intake of breath, a moment of awakening. Centuries of casual bargains and unquestioned customs seemed to tremble in the balance. Then old Rune thumped his walking stick against the ground. "The girl speaks truth," he announced, "and truth, once spoken, cannot be unheard." One by one, heads nodded. The change that had been brewing since that fateful harvest festival finally crystallized in that moment, not with rebellion or fanfare, but with simple, undeniable clarity. Autumn leaves drifted through Grey Hollow, as the village embraced change with the same inevitability as the turning seasons. In the weeks following the harvest festival, the ripples of Brenna and Calderon's stand against tradition transformed the community's fabric more thoroughly than any flood or fire ever could. The village square, once a place where casual cruelties went unchallenged, now hosted weekly councils where women's voices carried equal weight to men's. Young girls who had once kept their eyes downcast now spoke their minds freely, their futures no longer commodities to be bartered away. Aira, whose wisdom had previously been confined to birthing rooms, now sat prominently among the elders, her herbal knowledge and compassionate counsel sought by all. "Our daughters deserve the dignity of choice," the midwife proclaimed during one gathering, her weathered hands gesturing emphatically. "This is the true wealth of Grey Hollow." Calder found himself drawn increasingly into village life. The mountain man who had once shunned company now helped repair storm-damaged roofs and taught hunting skills to eager youngsters. Children no longer whispered fearfully about the hermit in the woods, but raced to greet him, clamoring for stories of wilderness survival. His cabin, once a lonely outpost, frequently hosted visitors, seeking advice or simply conversation. "Never thought I'd see the day when you'd be hosting tea parties," Brenna teased one afternoon, helping him arrange carved wooden cups for a group of apprentice trackers. He smiled, the expression no longer foreign to his face. "Never thought I'd want to," he admitted quietly. Brenna herself blossomed in the new atmosphere. The young woman who had once been mocked now led expeditions to gather rare mountain herbs, her knowledge earning respect from even the most stubborn traditionalists. Girls followed her example, standing straighter and speaking more boldly. Even Osric underwent a transformation. The tanner worked diligently at his craft, donating leather for community projects and speaking little. When he did speak, it was with careful consideration, the careless cruelty of his jest seemingly burned away by shame and regret. He approached Brenna one market day, offering a finely worked leather satchel. "For your herbs," he said simply, unable to meet her eyes. She accepted with quiet dignity, the gesture understood for what it was, the beginning of amends. Only Halden remained unchanged, his forge fires burning less frequently as villagers increasingly took their business elsewhere. The smith's influence waned as surely as summer heat, giving way to autumn chill. In homes throughout Grey Hollow, new tapestries appeared on walls, woven with symbols of freedom and choice rather than submission. The village had awakened to its own potential, discovering that traditions could be honored without being imprisoned by them, and that true strength lay not in rigid customs, but in the courage to change them. The harvest festival had returned to Grey Hollow, painting the village in amber and gold just as it had 1 year before. But everything else had changed. The same square that had witnessed Brenna's humiliation now hosted a celebration where young women moved freely, their laughter genuine rather than forced, their participation a choice rather than an obligation. Calderon stood at the edge of the fairground, his weathered hands relaxed at his sides. The mountain man who had once been an outsider now nodded at passing villagers, accepting their greetings with quiet dignity. Beside him, Brenna watched a group of children perform a dance around a pile of harvested wheat, her eyes bright with contentment. "I never thought I'd enjoy the festival again," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Now I look forward to it." Calder's gaze softened as he looked at her. "You made this change possible," he replied. "Not me, Across the square, Era distributed cups of spiced cider, her practiced hands moving efficiently. The midwife caught their eye and raised her cup in salute. Near the weaving stalls, even Osric seemed transformed, his shoulders no longer hunched with shame as he displayed his leather goods. The tanner had begun the slow work of making amends, starting with a public apology to his niece that had left many villagers wiping away tears. Old Rune hobbled through the crowd, stopping to tell children about the prophecy that had been fulfilled, not through magic, but through courage. The elder had finally understood that legends were meant to inspire change, not enforce stagnation. "Look," Brenna said, pointing to where two young girls were teaching Haldan's son a complicated string game. The smith himself stood awkwardly nearby, his influence diminished but his presence tolerated. Even he had begun to adapt to Grey Hollow's new ways. As twilight deepened, lanterns were lit around the square, casting warm pools of light across faces both familiar and renewed. A fiddler struck up a tune, and couples formed circles for dancing. "Will you join them?" Kelder asked, nodding toward the dancers. Britta smiled. "Perhaps later. For now, I'm content right here." They stood in comfortable silence, witnesses to the transformation they had helped create. The mountain herbs and Era's remedies, the carved figurines that children now received as gifts rather than consolation, the rope techniques taught freely to all who wished to learn, these were the new traditions of Grey Hollow. The village had discovered what Calder and Brinna had known all along, that no person's worth could be measured in silver or cents, that no casual word should determine a life's course, and that the courage to question old ways could ripple outward, changing not just one fate, but an entire community's future.